You're here, listening, in the dark, I guess. I'm not sure if I should tell you these stories, but since you're already here, tell me, where are you right now? And what time is it there? Leave it in the comments. I hope you're not alone, because, after this, you might wish you were. The birthday had been forgotten until the moment it had been remembered. A call had been received on the drive home, gentle, urgent, and threaded with subtle disappointment. A cake had been requested. The home-baked one had collapsed in the oven, an attempt made in good faith but poor timing. The daughter, Evelyn, had warned them both that store-bought would be safer. The request had been obeyed. A cake had been purchased, and on impulse, a stop had been made at a small shop tucked between shuttered stores, glowing dimly under the failing daylight. Breath. The intention had been to purchase a card, just a card, and perhaps a small inexpensive toy. But as the aisles had been wandered, something had caught the eye, not because of brightness, not because of price, because it had been wrong. There, surrounded by cheap plastic imports and forgotten holiday clearance, had stood a single porcelain doll, framed in dustless light. It had been beautiful, unreasonably so. The craftsmanship had betrayed nothing modern. Its face had been smooth, detailed, almost breathing, its eyes dark but alive, and its hair, rich, curled, gleaming, had shimmered like real silk. And most unsettling of all, it had looked exactly like Evelyn. There had been no price tag, only a row of symbols where a barcode should have been. The scanner had flashed red. The screen had displayed one soul. No cashier had been seen. The counter had been empty, and in that absence, mistaken as opportunity rather than warning, the doll had been taken, wrapped gently, cradled, carried like something precious. No alarm had sounded, no voice had protested, and so the theft had been committed, not with guilt, with pride. Long break. Evelyn had loved it instantly. There had been no hesitation. Her smile had been radiant. Her arms had wrapped around the figure, as though made for it. It had been large, too large, nearly her size, but she had not minded. She had insisted on carrying it everywhere, and over the following days, her joy had shifted, not vanished, shifted. What had begun as excitement had calcified into fixation. She had begun to speak less. Her appetite had waned. She had ceased to play with anything else. She had been found whispering to the doll, her arms locked around it tightly during the night, her gaze drifting toward it in moments of stillness, as if waiting for it to respond. Breath. As Evelyn had begun to fade, the doll had begun to flourish. Her hair had darkened. Her skin had grown pale. Her back had hunched. Her fingers grown thin and clenched. But the doll, always the doll, had looked increasingly alive. Its porcelain skin had taken on a faint hue of warmth. Its smile, once subtle, had stretched unnaturally wide. And with each inch Evelyn had grown, the doll had grown in tandem. No one had been able to explain it, but its limbs had lengthened. Its posture had straightened. Its hair had grown, tangled and black. Break. Attempts had been made to remove it. Baths had been prepared. The doll had been taken from her arms, but Evelyn had wept with a strength she no longer should have possessed. She had howled and thrashed until she had collapsed, heaving and gray-faced. Fear had returned it to her arms. She had been left to rest, to lie still, to wither beside her beloved. Day after day, Evelyn had spoken to no one, only the doll. Long break, and then one night she had appeared beside the bed, not carried, standing, more alert than she had been in weeks, her eyes wide with fear, her lips trembling. No words had been needed, The fear had been genuine. She had come without the doll. She had come to say goodbye. The doll had been found alone in Evelyn's bed, its back perfectly straight, its head tilted just enough to appear deliberate, its hair splayed across the pillow like a dark halo. Moonlight had streamed through the curtains, faint, silver, sterile. It had landed directly on the doll's face. The air had felt thick, not hot, but heavy. A presence had been felt. The room had watched back. Breath. The body had moved instinctively. The doll had been seized, lifted by fragile shoulders. Its surface had been colder than expected, cold enough to sting. Then the first strike had landed. Porcelain had met floor. The second had cracked its surface. The third had broken it open, and what had spilled forth had not been stuffing, not clay, not shards. It had been blood, warm, red, familiar, and when the figure on the floor had been seen clearly under the light, it had not been the doll. It had been Evelyn. Break. The scream had never come, only the sound of a breath leaving the lungs, the sensation of knees hitting the floor, hands trembling, reaching, not believing. Her head had rested at an angle unnatural for sleep. Her hair had been matted. Her fingers, those small familiar fingers, had been clenched tightly into fists, and beside her the broken pieces of porcelain had reflected only his face. Long break. The light had been turned on. Footsteps had echoed. Voices had cried out. Accusations had followed. And soon silence had returned, but only after everything had been taken. Evelyn had been buried without her doll, because to the others there had never been one. Breath. Reports had been given. Records had been checked. The store had been visited, but the doll had never been in inventory. No camera had recorded the purchase. No cashier had recognized the face. The store owner had claimed to never have seen anyone fitting the description, and the security footage had shown only a man, wandering, purchasing a card, leaving alone. Alone. Break. Madness had been declared, temporarily, clinically. No malice had been found, only trauma, only grief. Treatment had been prescribed, isolation, observation. Eventually, he had been released, because he had spoken well, smiled at the right times, showed no signs of delusion, because the world preferred certainty, even when it was wrong. And on the day of release, when the city's air had tasted different, they had appeared. Long break. Not in nightmares, not in hallucinations, in hands, in windows, on shelves. Porcelain dolls, identical in shape, identical in structure, but with different faces, faces that resembled the girls holding them. Every one, not just likenesses, replicas, perfectly tailored. Hair, eyes, smile, each doll mirroring the child who carried it, and in their arms, each child had smiled, hugged tight, whispered secrets, and the dolls had listened. Breath. Posters had gone up, advertisements, limited edition, own one made just for you. Mothers had lined up, fathers had paid eagerly, children had clutched their new best friends, and all across the city, those dark glass eyes had stared, watching, waiting, welcoming. The city had changed, but not on the surface. Laughter had still echoed from playgrounds. Children had still run through parks. Families had still gathered around birthday cakes. But within it all, something had been carried. Something had been held tightly in the arms of nearly every child. Something cold, something silent. Breath. The dolls had multiplied, each one identical in size, each one unique in face, and in every instance, the face had matched the child who held it. Parents had marveled at the resemblance. Strangers had stopped to comment. Smiles had spread across streets, but in private, in shadowed bedrooms, behind closed doors, the children had stopped smiling. They had begun to sleep more, to eat less, to speak in half sentences, to lose weight, and none had wished to be separated from their doll. Break. Reports had come in waves, whispers in parenting forums, subtle questions to doctors, shrugged off theories at school gates. But the dolls had stayed. No one had known where they were made. No manufacturer had been listed. No address could be traced, yet they had continued to appear. Always on shelves, always in hands, always in homes, and the children had begun to change. Long break. At first, the resemblance had been simple, a mirrored face, a familiar hairstyle, but then nails had matched, scars, even birthmarks, then expressions, habits, mannerisms. Some parents had claimed to catch their daughters speaking in the doll's voice. Others had heard laughter from empty rooms. A few had entered bedrooms, only to find their child sleeping on the floor, the doll tucked neatly into the bed. None of these stories had reached the news. No headlines had reported dolls replacing daughters. But within each home, something had been noticed, and within each doll something had grown. Breath. Those who had tried to destroy them had failed. Fires had burned out before touching porcelain. Hammers had slipped. Pieces, once shattered, had reformed by morning. One father had locked his daughter's doll in a basement safe. The next day, she had been found curled around it again, bruises on her hands, where she had dug through concrete. The whisper had returned, but only to a few, only to those who had once held the first doll. The original to the man whose guilt had not faded. Break. He had walked the streets like a ghost, watching dolls in windows, noticing the slight tilt of the head, the subtle twitch of the fingers. He had seen one blink, once deliberate, measured. He had seen one smile, just a little too wide, its lips parting to reveal not porcelain teeth, but something else, something organic. Long break. By then the children had stopped speaking altogether. Classrooms had fallen silent. Teachers had dismissed it as viral fatigue. Parents had whispered about new disorders. But all the while, the dolls had been cradled tighter. One girl had been seen kissing hers slowly, then biting her own lip until it bled, then placing the blood on the doll's mouth. Another had carried hers into a church, placed it before the altar, and simply stared. And every time someone tried to separate them, the child had screamed. Not words, just sound, like an animal being torn from its mother. Breath. Then had come the vanishings. Quiet at first, a girl here, a boy there, each case dismissed, each disappearance explained away. But the parents had known. They had woken to empty beds, to broken windows, to dolls left behind with blank faces and cracked smiles, and from the porcelain mouths, teeth had begun to grow. By the time they had noticed the teeth, it had already been too late. The disappearances had increased. Some houses had been left entirely empty, plates still warm on the table, shoes at the door, but no voices, no bodies, only dolls, one on each pillow, all smiling. Breath. Hospitals had reported strange admissions, children who no longer responded to light, who breathed steadily, but remained absent, eyes wide open, glassy, mouths shut tight, fingers curled inward like porcelain imitations. One by one they had slipped away. The dolls left in their place had shown changes. Skin had softened, limbs had flexed. Some had been found sitting upright, without being placed that way. A nurse had claimed to see one walking. She had been dismissed. She had not returned to work. Break across the city. Porcelain had become more common, not just in toys, in window displays, in advertisements, in reflections. Mirrors had begun to show flickers, faces not quite human, not quite doll, children's features, stretched and stiffened, eyes that did not blink. Parents had reported hearing whispers from closets, laughter from drawers, the clinking of tiny ceramic feet on hardwood floors, but only at night, only when they had stopped looking directly at them. Long break. The man who had taken the first doll had not fled. He had remained, watching, waiting, understanding. Now that something had been traded that day, not stolen, given, not a soul, not just his daughter's life, but a gateway, a door opened by choice, and the dolls had come through it, not as invaders, as replacements. Breath in neighborhoods once filled with life. Silence had settled, playgrounds stood abandoned, chalk drawings faded under layers of dust, but in toy stores, shelves had never been fuller, each doll sitting neatly, waiting to be chosen, and still they smiled. Teeth no longer hidden, hair dark, matted, hands slightly outstretched, inviting, welcoming. Break. The company behind the dolls had never been found. No factory had been located. No customer support line had worked. Yet more were made, more were sold, more were given, and always the same result. Children vanished, Chiba dolls remained, or perhaps became. Long break. One day, in the center of the city, a new billboard had appeared. No warning, no brand name, just a message. She looks just like you. Below it a photo, a child, a doll, indistinguishable, and in their hands held between them, a cake, unlit candles, and the same expression of joy, or hunger. It was hard to tell. Breath. The man had walked past it without blinking, his mind long hollowed, his guilt long worn down. He had seen a girl watching him, porcelain face, human hands, or the other way around. He hadn't been sure, but he had seen Evelyn's eyes, just for a moment, and he had known the truth. The trade had never ended. The shop had never closed. The price had never stopped being collected, and it never would. The candles had still been flickering. The food had still been warm, and the silverware had just begun to sing against the porcelain when it had happened. A pause, not of sound, not of thought, but of time itself. Breath. It had not been a crash, nor a roar. Nothing had shattered, nothing had screamed, only the subtle sensation that everything had slowed. At first, the delay had been mistaken for distraction, a passing moment of quiet tension, the kind that arrives when words dry out mid-conversation and the weight of presence becomes suddenly unbearable. But then the fork had failed to rise, and the arm had refused to bend. Break. Across the table, Evelyn's lips had parted, barely, caught in the act of forming a word. One eye had blinked, halfway shut. A strand of steam had curled upward from her soup, forming a slow spiral, frozen, alive. The scent of rosemary had clung to the air as if sprayed with lacquer. A fly above the table had hovered, its wings half extended, held in place like a museum exhibit behind glass. No sound had escaped. No breath had finished. No heartbeat had been felt, moving forward. Time had buckled. Long break. The room had remained intact. No destruction. No darkness. Only a state of eternal near motion. Thoughts had continued, though, somehow, the mind had not stopped. The brain had kept turning, 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 endless, without release, without progress. It had taken what felt like a full day just to recognize the paralysis, another week to accept it, and then despair. Breath. The family had sat together, a portrait, a diorama, 4 people arranged in a frame of evening light, napkins on laps, knives poised, smiles paused, but only one had remained fully awake inside. Only Jonas. His thoughts had spiraled, looped, broken, rebuilt, over and over. He had watched the room in agonizing detail, ceiling fan blades in permanent rotation, dust motes hanging like stars. The world had not stopped. It had merely been stretched. Break, he had tried to move, fought against the glue that had filled his limbs. A blink had taken days. A finger twitch months. Pain had not existed, nor hunger, but the need to move had been overwhelming. An itch beneath the skin of reality itself. Time had become an ocean of glass, solid, unyielding, yet visible from within, and Jonas had been trapped in it. Long break, thought had become his only escape. Imagination, the only flame left. Memories had been revisited, like ancient texts, rewritten, obsessed over. Conversations once had were reconstructed, word by word. Moments once ignored had been relived in infinite loops. The sound of Evelyn's laugh, the feel of the spoon clinking her glass, their daughter Isla, smiling with too many teeth, her hand gripping a napkin, their son, Malcolm, not yet arrived, still upstairs, still in his room, still untouched by this collapse, and Jonas, frozen mid-breath, half lifting a glass of wine, but thinking, always thinking. Breath, the thought had emerged eventually. What if it never ends? Not fear, not panic, just the slow, creeping realization that forever had arrived, and it had come during dinner. Time had not just slowed, it had fractured. Each moment had begun to echo, each thought repeating itself in waves, until the repetition became unbearable. Breath, Jonas had begun to measure reality in details. The arc of a droplet of sauce mid-air, the precise way Evelyn's wrist had flexed as she reached for the bread, the rise of Isla's eyebrow in response. All frozen, all eternal. Even the flame of the candle had ceased to flicker. It had stayed there, a sculpture of light, caught mid-waver. The air had smelled of basil and smoke. The tablecloth had wrinkled under unseen tension. Somewhere a record had been left spinning, a single note suspended in its final vibration. No decay, no relief. Only now, drawn across a blade so thin it sliced the mind. Break, Jonas had wondered in time, if death had occurred. Not dramatic death, but a slow, creeping erasure. A death without ending, without finality. A living death. He had tried again to reach Evelyn, to move a finger, to turn his gaze, to mouth her name. But eternity had passed before the muscle had twitched, and even then, no motion had been completed, only the knowing that motion had been attempted. Long break. In the folds of his mind, Jonas had begun to build things, a memory palace, a ghost of the house, a replica of the dinner table. But this time, he had been alone in it. He had walked around it in thought. He had placed his wife in one chair, his daughter in another. He had removed the food. He had blown out the candles. He had imagined standing, walking to the stairs, climbing toward Malcolm's door. In the imagined hallway he had knocked. No answer. He had opened it, slowly, knowing that within was a boy untouched by time, left alone in the absolute silence of upstairs. Breath. What horror had grown inside that room. How much of Malcolm remained. How much mind could exist without movement. A child, staring at a screen forever, or asleep, or screaming behind closed lips. The idea had rooted deep. It had become obsession. Jonas had tried to reach him physically, but the chair had never left the floor. His legs had refused to answer. He had been trapped in the moment before motion, a portrait of a father, never rising. Break. The world outside had surely changed, but inside the dining room, the dust had hung still. The candles had burned eternally. The soup had remained warm. He had considered, maybe the flame wasn't fire anymore. Maybe the warmth wasn't heat. Maybe none of this was physical at all. Maybe this was mind alone. A prison built from thought, a tomb maintained by memory. Maybe the food had decayed long ago. Maybe the house had collapsed. Maybe the bodies had crumbled to dust. But because Jonas had remembered, they had remained. Long break. A new fear had begun to form. Not that time would resume. Not that death would arrive. But that nothing ever would. That this suspension was final. That this moment was it. That consciousness itself had been stretched beyond recognition. And somewhere along the line, Something divine had blinked and forgotten to blink again. Breath, and in that pause, Jonas had been left behind. Time had stopped being measured. There were no minutes, no hours, only sensations stretched thin, thoughts repeated until they became texture. The past had begun to rot. Memories revisited, too often had decayed. The edges dulled, the order uncertain. Breath, Jonas had forgotten the day of the week, then the month, then whether the dinner had been meant to celebrate something. A birthday, perhaps, an anniversary. Even the name of the meal had faded. Only the image had remained. Steam, plate, candle, silence. The image had become sacred, a relic, a false god, crafted from the illusion of routine, and yet it had ruled over him. Break. He had stopped trying to move. The effort had become a torment. Each attempt to flex a muscle had only confirmed the weight of his paralysis. A scream had been built in his lungs, but even its idea had become exhausting. So he had turned inward again, back to the stairs, back to Malcolm's room. This time the memory had shifted, no longer silent. It had become warped, not wrong, just distorted. The hallway had twisted slightly, the door had leaned, the doorknob had grown too large. The shadows had begun to watch, and inside, not Malcolm, but a shape, child-sized, curled, breathing slowly, but the breath had sounded like his own. Breath. He had left the memory. He had tried to think of other things, vacations, birthdays, Ella's first words, Evelyn's old perfume, but each memory had decayed on contact, overhandled, abused by repetition. They had begun to fracture like old tapes, break, and then the fractures had spread outward. The candlelight had begun to pulse, not flicker, but twitch. Ella's eyes had seemed to shimmer, not with light, but with movement, like something behind them had grown restless, and Evelyn's fingers, once delicately curled, had begun to stretch, too far, too long. The dinner table had remained still, but the world around it had begun to soften. The edges blurred, the room lost its angles, the shadows stopped obeying the light. Long break, a new realization had struck. This was no longer the real house, not entirely. This was a house rebuilt by memory, sustained by one mind, by one terrified, unblinking survivor. Jonas had become the anchor of this unreality, and his mind had begun to rot. Breath. He had thought, once, that insanity would feel loud, like laughter in an empty room. But now he understood. Insanity felt like eternity, familiar, silent, identical, and it came with company. Because across the table, Evelyn's eyes had finally shifted, not fully, just slightly, enough to betray awareness. Break, not the old Evelyn, not the wife he had once known, but something else wearing her skin, sitting perfectly still, perfectly posed, and smiling. The smile had been wrong, not because of the shape, but because of the timing. No expression should have lasted that long. No emotion could survive this many years, this many seconds, and yet it had persisted. Breath. Jonas had tried to ignore it, had tried to reason with himself. It's just a trick of perception, he had thought, a phantom movement, created by boredom, but it had remained constant, not deepening, not fading, like it had always been there, like it had been waiting to be noticed. Then Isla's hand had shifted, barely, a pinky twitch, just enough to deny chance. The weight of eternity had tilted. Break. For the first time in what might have been centuries, a new idea had emerged. They were not alone. Others were awakening, or becoming something else, no longer frozen, not exactly moving, somewhere in between. The house had begun to shimmer at the edges. Chairs no longer cast clear shadows. Walls seemed to breathe, and through the flickering candlelight, Jonas had seen something new. A crack in the corner of the room, thin, vertical, impossibly black, like a fracture in glass, like a tear in paper, but deeper. Long break. It had grown slowly, like mold spreading across a ceiling, like time remembering how to rot. He had stared at it until it widened, and through it, He had seen nothing. Not darkness, not stars. Just the absence of everything. The void before thought. The thing that comes before time begins. And it had stared back. Breath. Then Evelyn's head had tilted. Slowly. Too slowly. Like the memory of a movement. Not the act itself. Her eyes had found his. And for the first time in forever, he had known she was still there. But it hadn't been a reunion. It had been a warning. Because the thing behind the crack had started whispering. Break, no words. Just pressure. Just a presence that pushed from the other side. A suggestion that the time trap had been built intentionally. That this wasn't a malfunction. That this was the design. Jonas hadn't gone mad. He had been preserved, cured of decay, held in place so something else could grow around him. Time wasn't broken. It had been paused like a lung full of breath, so something ancient could inhale. And now the exhale had begun. Long break. The candle flames had finally started to bend. The steam had begun to rise again. The fork had fallen from his hand. Mid-lift, the weight of seconds had returned, like gravity snapping back after spaceflight. But it had not brought relief, because Evelyn was blinking now rhythmically. Imla's hand had lifted. The world had resumed, but not the same world. Jonas had screamed, and this time he had heard it.